June 1941. The German Wehrmacht stood on the brink of its greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler and his generals, riding high on the crushing victories in Poland and France, were intoxicated by their own perceived invincibility. They saw the Soviet Union as a colossus with feet of clay, a vast, underdeveloped nation whose untermentioned population and primitive army would crumble within weeks. The timetable was audacious: Moscow by October, total victory before the first heavy snows. In their war rooms, under the warm summer light, they debated logistics, not survival. Winter clothing for the troops? Dismissed. Heavy-duty lubricants for tanks in extreme cold? Overlooked. "We will be home by Christmas," Hitler famously declared, a statement born of pure, unadulterated hubris. They believed so fiercely in their racial and military superiority that they literally forbade their soldiers from preparing for winter. This was not just a strategic error, it was a psychological blind spot, a fatal flaw in the German war machine. They were about to march into the vast, unforgiving plains of Russia, armed with arrogance and utterly unprepared for the true enemy that awaited them, General Winter. The initial phase of Barbarossa seemed to confirm every German expectation. The Blitzkrieg tore through the Soviet defenses with a ferocity that shocked the world. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in colossal Kesselschlachten, cauldron battles. The panzer divisions covered hundreds of miles in weeks, their speed and coordination overwhelming any resistance. Newsreels in Germany showed triumphant columns, endless lines of captured equipment, and jubilant soldiers. The propaganda machine roared, "The beast of the East is dying." Hitler's grand visions seemed to be coming true. The boundless Russian landscape at first felt like a playground for their tanks, an endless vista for their relentless advance. The German soldiers reveled in their conquests, believing they were marching toward a glorious, quick victory. The summer sun, which seemed to bless their advance, masked the insidious creep of autumn and the distant whispers of a formidable, ancient adversary. They were giants indeed, but giants dancing on the edge of a frozen abyss. Even in the heady days of summer, the first cracks in the Blitzkrieg's armor began to show. The sheer scale of Russia defied all planning. German supply lines, which had worked so flawlessly in smaller Western European countries, stretched for hundreds, then thousands of miles. The Russian roads, often little more than dirt tracks, turned into impassable quagmires with the first autumn rains. German trucks, designed for European highways, broke down constantly. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts simply couldn't keep up with the rapid advance. Horses, once dismissed as old-fashioned, became the only reliable transport, but they too suffered from exhaustion and lack of fodder. The arrogant assumption that victory would be swift had left no room for logistical contingency. German soldiers, who started the campaign well-fed, now began to feel the gnawing pangs of hunger. The green hell of summer was slowly transforming into a sticky brown trap, swallowing men and machines whole. The Wehrmacht was conquering territory, but it was losing the battle against time, space, in the sheer, brutal immensity of Russia. Then came the autumn of 1941, and with it, the first ominous warnings. The brilliant blue skies turned a sickly gray. The first scattered snowflakes, light as dust, began to fall. The air grew sharp, biting, and relentlessly cold. German soldiers, still wearing their thin summer uniforms, their boots ill-suited for the gathering chill, shivered in their foxholes. The mud, once a hindrance, now began to freeze into rock-hard ruts, tearing apart tank tracks and truck tires. The generals back in Berlin, still obsessed with taking Moscow, dismissed these reports as temporary weather. But for the men on the front lines, the message was clear. A new, far more formidable enemy was gathering on the horizon. The easy victories of summer were fading, replaced by the grim reality of a war against the elements.
The German giants, so confident in their machines, were about to learn that Russia fights not just with tanks and men, but with its very breath, its very soul.
The cold, dismissed by Hitler, became the Wehrmacht's silent assassin. As temperatures plummeted, reaching -20 degrees Celsius, then -30 degrees Celsius, the finely tuned German war machine began to seize up. The diesel fuel in their tanks, trucks, and artillery froze solid, turning into a thick, waxy sludge. Lubricants designed for temperate European climates became as hard as glass. Tank engines, which required hours of preheating, refused to start. Rifle bolts froze shut. The vaunted panzers, once the symbol of unstoppable power, became frozen giants, immobile hulks of steel stuck in the snow, vulnerable targets for any Soviet attack. German mechanics, usually efficient and resourceful, resorted to desperate measures, lighting bonfires under engines, using blowtorches, even urinating on frozen parts in a futile attempt to thaw them. This wasn't just a breakdown, it was a full-scale mechanical apocalypse. The arrogance that had rejected winterization now meant that thousands of German soldiers were left defenseless, stranded in the vast, unforgiving cold, their mighty machines reduced to useless, frozen monuments to a fatal miscalculation.
For the German soldiers, the lack of winter clothing was a slow, agonizing death sentence. They had marched into Russia in light summer uniforms, optimistic that they would be home before the first frost. But as the Siberian winds swept across the plains, bringing temperatures that dropped to an unimaginable -40 degrees centigrade, those uniforms offered no protection. Fingers and toes froze solid, turning black and falling off. Frostbite became rampant, affecting hundreds of thousands of men. Soldiers stuffed newspapers, straw, or even dead animals into their boots and coats in a futile attempt to find warmth. They improvised hats and scarves from bedsheets and rags, but nothing could stop the relentless cold. Thousands froze to death in their foxholes, their bodies found rigid as statues, still clutching their rifles. These men, once proud conquerors, were reduced to shivering, desperate survivors, their morale shattering under the brutal onslaught of an enemy they could not shoot, an enemy that felt no mercy, an enemy called General Winter. The arrogance of their leaders had effectively condemned them to die a slow, agonizing death in the vast, frozen wilderness of Russia. The German soldiers' feet were perhaps the most tragic casualties of the winter. Their standard-issue leather boots, perfect for temperate European mud, were utterly useless in the Russian snow and ice. They offered no insulation against the freezing ground, quickly becoming rigid, icy shells that trapped moisture and guaranteed frostbite. Soldiers would try to wrap their feet in rags, but the constant dampness meant their feet were always wet, always freezing. Walking became an agony, then an impossibility. The sight of thousands of soldiers with black, gangrenous feet, waiting for evacuation that rarely came, became a common horror. Many would simply give up, sitting in the snow, waiting for death to take them. The lack of proper winter footwear, born of the dilution of a quick victory, rendered entire divisions immobile. The mighty Wehrmacht, the swift Blitzkrieg, was now an army of cripples, bogged down not by enemy fire, but by the relentless, penetrating cold that turned their boots into instruments of torture. They had come to conquer, but now they could barely walk. By early December 1941, the German spearheads reached the very gates of Moscow. Through the swirling snow, the frozen, desperate soldiers could see the glimmer of the Kremlin's domes. They were so close, just a few more miles. Hitler, still blinded by his hubris, demanded a final, all-out push, but the men were at the absolute breaking point. Their rifles froze, their tanks were immobile, and their bodies were ravaged by the cold. They had conquered thousands of miles, but the last few miles to Moscow proved insurmountable. This was the moment the Wehrmacht truly broke. They simply could not move forward anymore.
The Soviet counteroffensive, launched with fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, slammed into the frozen, exhausted Germans. This was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological collapse. The dream of a quick victory shattered against the reality of Russian resilience and the brutal, unforgiving winter. The giants, frozen solid, had reached their limit, and now they were forced to retreat, leaving behind thousands of their dead in the snow. Just as the Wehrmacht finally stalled, the Soviets launched their massive winter counteroffensive. They had meticulously prepared for the cold, their soldiers equipped with warm padded jackets, felt boots, Valenki, and fur hats. Their tanks, especially the T-34, were designed to operate in extreme conditions. The Germans, who had dismissed the Soviets as inferior, were now facing a well-equipped, determined enemy that was perfectly adapted to the environment. The Soviet ski troops, moving silently and swiftly through the snow, flanked the frozen German positions, sowing panic and chaos. The Germans found themselves fighting on two fronts, against the relentless Soviet army and against the even more brutal force of nature. This wasn't just a battle, it was a rout. The Red Army, once thought to be shattered, now pushed back with furious momentum, sending the ill-equipped Germans reeling. The Wehrmacht, which had arrogantly dismissed the need for winter gear, was now being destroyed by an enemy that understood the true power of the Russian winter. The frozen giants were crumbling under the relentless assault of an enemy they had so fatally underestimated. The retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941–42 became a harrowing odyssey of death and despair. For the German soldiers, it was a living nightmare. Thousands succumbed to frostbite, exhaustion, and disease. Their abandoned equipment, tanks, trucks, and artillery littered the frozen roads, creating a macabre trail of mechanical corpses. The frozen giants were not just stuck, they were breaking apart. The discipline that had held the Wehrmacht together for so long began to fray. Rommel's Blitzkrieg doctrine, built on relentless speed, was shattered by the simple, brutal fact that no one could move in such conditions. This wasn't just a tactical withdrawal, it was a desperate scramble for survival, a humiliating retreat that proved the fundamental flaw in Hitler's grand strategy. The arrogant assumption that Russia would fall before winter had cost the Wehrmacht dearly, breaking its spirit and its body. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich, which had seemed so close in the summer, now lay frozen and shattered on the vast, unforgiving plains of Russia, a monument to the ultimate price of hubris. As the German army began to disintegrate in the face of the Soviet winter counteroffensive, many generals advised a strategic retreat to safer, shorter lines, but Hitler, obsessed with his own myth of willpower, issued his infamous halt order. He forbade any withdrawal, demanding that every soldier stand and die where he was. This was the ultimate clash between military reality and ideological madness. Hitler believed that if he allowed his troops to retreat, the front would turn into a Napoleonic rout. By forcing his frozen giants to stay in their shallow, icy foxholes, he effectively turned the Eastern Front into a 1,000-mile-long slaughterhouse. Soldiers were ordered to hold ground that had no tactical value, simply because Hitler's pride couldn't accept the loss of territory. This decision saved the front from immediate collapse, but at a catastrophic human cost. It destroyed the professional bond between the officers and their Führer, and it condemned hundreds of thousands of men to be surrounded and slowly annihilated by the cold and the Red Army. By midwinter, the German army was forced to cannibalize its own equipment. Since no spare parts could reach the front through the blizzards, mechanics would dismantle 3 broken tanks to make one barely functional one. The pride of the Panzerwaffe was reduced to a collection of scrap metal. This was the death of the Blitzkrieg's technological edge. In the summer, these tanks were the symbols of a new era of war. Now, they were iron coffins, heat leeches that drained the life out of anyone who touched them. The frozen giants weren't just the men, but the machines themselves.
the sophisticated optics of German Tiger prototypes in Panzer IVs cracked in the frost. This mechanical breakdown was a direct result of the High Command's arrogance. They had designed machines for a European parade, not for a Siberian nightmare. Every abandoned tank was a silent confession that Germany's industrial might had been defeated by the simple, brutal chemistry of ice. As the temperatures dropped, the German soldier's body became his own worst enemy. To survive -40 degrees, a man needs 6,000 calories a day. The German supply lines were lucky to provide 1,000. Starvation became as deadly as the Soviet snipers. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, were slaughtered for food, their frozen meat hacked off with axes. This was the ultimate humiliation for an army that considered itself the most advanced in the world. Soldiers who had once dreamed of a greater Germany were now reduced to fighting over a piece of horsehide or a crust of frozen bread. The arrogance of the master race ideology crumbled under the weight of an empty stomach. In the frozen wastes of Russia, there were no Untermenschen or supermen. There were only the living and the dead, and the cold made no distinction between the two. While the Germans huddled together for warmth, becoming easy targets, the Soviets unleashed the White Death. Siberian hunters, recruited for their skills in the taiga, moved through the snow like ghosts. To these men, the extreme cold was home. They used the wind and the blizzards as cover, picking off German officers and sentries from hundreds of yards away. For the German soldiers, the psychological pressure became unbearable. You couldn't see the enemy, you couldn't hear him, but you knew he was there, waiting for you to move. Every time a German soldier stood up to shake off the snow, he risked a bullet to the head. The arrogance of the German Rassenkampf, racial struggle, was turned on its head. The very people the Nazis called primitive were outthinking and outfighting the civilized Wehrmacht in the most brutal conditions on Earth. Beyond the bullets and the frostbite, another enemy haunted the German lines: typhus. In the crowded, unhygienic dugouts where men huddled for warmth, body lice spread like wildfire. Hygiene was impossible. Water was for drinking, not washing. The German medical system, which had functioned so well in France, collapsed in Russia. There were no antibiotics, no clean bandages, and no way to evacuate the sick. Thousands of frozen giants died not from Soviet steel, but from high fevers and delirium in the dark. The German army was rotting from within. The soldiers began to realize that their leaders in Berlin didn't care about their suffering. They were just numbers on a map, expendable assets in a war of ego. The invincible army was now a plague-ridden mass of humanity, dying in a foreign land for a cause that was frozen solid. The frozen giants were also deaf and blind. The extreme cold played havoc with radio equipment, and the vast distances meant that communication between the front lines and headquarters often vanished for days. Units were lost in the snow, unaware that they had been bypassed or surrounded. This great silence fueled the panic. Without orders, without news, and without any sense of the bigger picture, the German soldiers felt abandoned by God and country. The sophisticated Blitzkrieg coordination, which relied on lightning-fast communication, was silenced by the Russian winter. Commanders were forced to lead by instinct, but when your men are freezing and starving, instinct only tells you to run. The silence of the Russian plains was the sound of a superpower dying. When the spring thaws finally came, they revealed a landscape of horror. As the snow melted, thousands of German bodies were uncovered, preserved perfectly by the ice. These were the frozen monuments to German hubris. They were found in trenches, under trucks, and in open fields, men who had simply stopped moving and never started again. For the returning German units and the advancing Soviets, these frozen statues were a grim reminder of the price of underestimating Russia. They were a generation of young men who had been promised glory and given a grave of ice.
These bodies would remain in the Russian soil for decades, a silent, frozen army that never went home. They were the ultimate proof that nature is the final arbiter of war, and it had judged the German Empire and found it wanting. As the survivors of the winter of 1941 limped westward, the ghost of Napoleon Bonaparte seemed to walk beside them. The German generals, who had studied history so carefully, had fallen into the exact same trap as the French emperor 129 years earlier. They had won the battles, but lost the war against the climate. The parallels were haunting. The overstretched supply lines, the burning of villages, and the final crushing blow of General Winter. The arrogance of the 20th century was no match for the timeless reality of the Russian landscape. Hitler had promised a new type of war, but he had ended up with the oldest one in history, a desperate retreat through the snow. The myth of German military genius was shattered. They were no longer the masters of war. They were just the latest empire to be broken by the Russian winter.
The men who survived the first winter in Russia were never the same. They were known as the Eastern Front veterans, and they carried a darkness in their souls that no metal could cover. They had seen the limits of human endurance and the true face of the Nazi regime's incompetence. When they returned home on leave, they couldn't describe the horror to their families. How do you describe the sound of a man freezing to death? How do you explain that your invincible army was saved by urinating on tank engines? These men became the frozen giants of the mind. They were the first to know that the war was lost, long before the bombs started falling on Berlin. They had seen the end of the world in the Russian snow, and they knew that the 1,000-year Reich was a lie that was melting away. The story of the frozen giants is a warning etched in ice. It is a story of what happens when a nation's pride blinds it to the most basic realities of life and death. The Wehrmacht entered Russia as gods of war and left as broken shells. They had underestimated the enemy, they had underestimated the land, and most importantly, they had underestimated the power of nature to humble the arrogant. Today, the Russian plains are quiet, but beneath the soil, the remains of the invincible army still lie, a permanent part of the landscape they tried to conquer. The ice has long since melted, but the lesson remains. No amount of steel or willpower can defeat a winter that is built into the soul of a nation. This was the tragedy of the Wehrmacht, an army that was frozen not just by the weather, but by the cold, hard heart of its own hubris. This is WW2 Uncut Story. Thank you for watching.